Welcome to Networks Learning. My name is Reyaz Gul. We are conducting Palo Alto firewall training. In today's video, we are going to configure OSPF routing protocol on Palo Alto firewall. OSPF is a dynamic routing protocol. In my previous videos, we were going through the static routing. So now we will migrate our topology onto dynamic OSPF single area routing. So OSPF has multiple areas. You can configure multiple areas based on your requirement in order to break down your large logical topology into different chunks in order to have a granular control over the routing instances. So in this topology, we have LAN segment, DMZ, and a WAN segment. So firewall is currently configured with static routing, and all the switches are also configured with static routing. So we will migrate static routing to the dynamic using OSPF routing protocol. So this is the topology. We also have a edge router which is connected to physical machine, which is providing the internet connectivity, and it's also receiving the default route for any traffic that is not present on this topology. And edge router, we will configure it to provide a default route towards firewall, so that any traffic that needs to go outside, which is not for the networks that are not residing on this topology, it should send traffic to edge router, and based on that, edge router will forward it to the upstream internet. So I'll show you my configuration on the switch first, the LAN switch, which currently we have a static routing configured. Show run. So you can see over here we have a static route configured over here, and using this route we will be able to reach 888. We will first check the edge router gateway 10.10.50.1. So you can see over here from LAN switch we are able to reach edge router gateway, you mean. So in order to reach to the internet, I have to enable the NAT configuration on edge router. Yeah, it's there. So we are able to reach from our LAN switch to the internet. I showed you the static route configured over here. This is the static route. So on firewall we also have some static routing. Show routing route. You will see over here 000 is pointing towards 10.10.50.1, which is the edge router LAN segment, active, and it's static. So we have the default routing configured over here. Similarly, on edge router we have a default route which is pointing towards the internet, and static routes configured for our LAN segment, which is 192.168.1.0 over here, and 192.168 1050. There was some netting pool as well, which is 10.50.0 is the LANs 10.150.0, which is also routed towards firewall. So now we will configure dynamic routing first on firewall, and then the LAN switch, and then on edge router. Edge router I have already configured because it's MikroTik. So in order to shorten the video, I have already configured MikroTik, but we'll configure the Palo Alto, and then we will move to the Cisco switch, which is connected to the LAN segment, and we'll configure all the devices with loopback interfaces. On edge router we have 10.100.150. On Palo Alto I have 10.100.150, and LAN switch is having 10.50.50.50 as loopback interface. We'll put all loopback interfaces in the routing instances and other routing segments as well. So on Palo Alto firewall we have to navigate to networks, then in virtual routers. First I'll show you the current routing entries in the routing table. You can see over here all the routing entries are statically configured. There is no dynamic or OSPF or any other BGP configuration over here. So all the routing table is having static routes. So moving on to the default router instance, we'll have to go to the OSPF, enable it. Will not reject default route, because and edge router will be providing default route to Palo Alto firewall, and we want Palo Alto firewall to provide default route to the neighbors. So that's why we will not check that reject default route box. So router ID will be 10 100 100. I think it's 50 10 100 150. Areas would be backbone area, single instance area. You can have multiple areas as well, and the type is normal. There are multiple types of areas where you can configure stub, not so stubby area as well. In interfaces, you have to provide the interfaces for which you want to enable the routing instances. So we'll leave the default configuration, because the default configuration, if we modify these parameters over here, we have to modify on both ends of the OSPF interfaces. Otherwise your neighborship will not become full instance. So enabled on interface 1/1, then interface 1/2, then interface 1/3, which is the DMZ, and we'll enable it on loopback interface as well. Loopback interface is also configured as router ID. So my router ID and loopback interfaces are having the same IP addresses. So this is the thing you have to configure the OSPF over here. And no export rules. Export rules are just a configuration that is used for the redistribution. If you have some redistribution profile, first you create redistribution profile over here, then you add export rules and call the redistribution profile over here. Area authentication profile, we are not using any authentication. We called all the interfaces over here. Loopback interface, I'll put it into a passive interface because it's not the interface that is physical one. So we need to tell the firewall this is not a physical interface, and no routing what you say neighborship will be made on this interface. Click on OK, click commit. So I'll return once the routing the commit changes are successfully done. Till that I'll pause the video. So the changes on firewall are successfully completed. Now we'll move on to the lane switch segment. From Palo Alto firewall, configuration is done, and we move to the lane switch. On lane switch, first I will show you the interfaces. We have a directly connected interface with the firewall on the lane segment 1.150. Then we have another switch connected to this lane switch, which is the ABC switch name 192.168.2.1. Then we have a loopback interface. We'll configure all the interfaces with OSPF routing, or we'll inject all these subnets into the routing instance of the OSPF. Config T, router OSPF 10, router ID 10.50.50.50, network 192.168.1.0.0.0.0. 255 area 0. This is wildcard mask against this subnet network 192.168.2.0.0.0.255 area 0 and network 10.50.50.0.0.0.0 area 0. We are using only single area instance we are configuring over here. That's why we are putting area 0 always. So area 0 is the backbone area, and which is the reference point inside the routing instance of the OSPF. Any area that needs to go anywhere in between areas, it must go via the area 0. So that's the reason for configuring area 0. And if you have multiple areas, in that case this logic works, which I told you just now. So you can see over here our neighbor instance is up, and we should have a neighbor listed over here. Show IP OSPF neighbor. You can see over here it's fully loaded, and we should see some routes. Show IP route OSPF. Yeah, you can see over here we have routes received on via this neighbor 10.10.50.0, which is the firewall in edge router segment, and we have 10.100.100.50, which is the loopback on the firewall, and 172.16.00, which is the subnet of the DMZ interface. So this is how you can configure the routing on firewall, Palo Alto firewall in DMZ switch, and on lane switch we receive these, and on Palo Alto firewall we should have the routing entries for the routing type OSPF. So you can see over here we have a default route as well from the edge router 10.10.50.1 with O1 OSPF, and it's internal OSPF internal, and we have 10.10.50.50, which is the loopback on lane switch, and it's going towards 192.161.50, and it's active. you see other are not active, only this route is active because we have a static routing configured on firewall. So static routing is preferred over dynamic routing, because if you have a static routing configured, so by default for the connected interfaces it has a administrative distance of 1, and for static routing you have administrative distance of based on what you configure. Connected interfaces you have 0, and for uh, static routing you have a default administrative distance of 1. So that's why we are not able to locate. And over here we also have some static routing configured. So you can see over here we have static route configured over here. So I'm going to remove this route as well. So now you can see we are able to see default route over here from OSPF as external type 1. Type 1 will add a cost when it crosses the multiple hosts, so that's why it's sending firewall is sending as OSPF external type 1, because it's receiving it as OSPF external type 1 from the edge router. On edge router we have a routing table over here. You can see over here dynamic, active and static, which is this one is the default route. And for lane segment, which is 192.168.1.0, it's going via active and static route, which is the static entry configured. Currently it's having a distance of 1, but for dynamic routing instance it's receiving on using OSPF, but it's not active. As soon as I remove the static entry, which is this one, this DO, you will see DOA over here. So let's disable this one. You can see over here 192.168.1.0. As soon as I remove the entry for static route, the edge router is considering this destination reachable via OSPF, dynamic, active and OSPF 10.10.50.2, and administrative distance is 110. So that's how you configure dynamic routing on firewall and Cisco switch and other infrastructure inside your network. So now we are able to see, and we can ping 10.10.50.1, which is the firewall inside interface. And one more thing is that on Palo Alto firewall you should have entries for the routing table using OSPF. You can see over here we have a default route going towards the edge router, and we have entry for our lane loopback interface 10.50.50.50, which is going towards active OSPF inter area 172.1600.0 is directly connected, and 192.168.2.0, which is having two routing entries. One is active static entry and one is OSPF. So if we remove the static routing, the firewall will consider the dynamic OSPF routing entries for the static configured routes. So we will remove this one, public pool reachability and lane segment. We'll delete this. You're okay, and you will see the results will be changed over here. Currently we are only having one active route from the OSPF instance, but let me remove this. I have removed the static routing entries and let the commit changes happen. So after that this result will be changed over here in the routing instance of the firewall. So the configurational changes are successfully completed on a firewall. So now we will again check the routing table on the firewall, so you will see the difference. You can see over here previously we were having a static route entry for default route, which was pointed towards ether 1/1. So now you have entry from the OSPF inter area, which is active. You can see over here, and at the same time we have an entry for 192.168.2.0, which is going towards 150, and its firewall is learning using OSPF inter area and it's active. Before that these routes were not active. So any default route which we are receiving from edge router that is active on the firewall currently. Previously we were not able to locate over here in the routing table because the static routes were configured. Static route is having the lower administrative distance, that's why it's preferred one, and dynamic routing OSPF has administrative distance of 110, that's why they were not shown over here. And one more thing over here, I will show you the neighborship on the firewall. Show routing route show routing route OSPF, sorry, routing protocol OSPF neighbor. So you can see over here we have one neighbor 10.10.50.1 with 10.100.150, which is our edge router, you can see over here. And the second one is instance is default 192.168.1.50 and 10.50.50, which is our lane switch over here. So both upstream and downstreams we have neighborship using OSPF routing protocol, and we can easily route any packet via firewall using dynamic IP addresses, dynamic routing protocol, sorry. In the routing table of the firewall, you can see over here we have default route with active OSPF, and we have 10.50.50.50, which is loopback on lane switch. You are landing via OSPF, and all the routes are landing via OSPF over here. And on the edge router, I'll show you the routing configuration for OSPF. This is the default instance with the loop router ID, and only 10.10.50.0, which is the segment between firewall and edge router. And you can see over here neighbor, and you will see over here routes learned from the OSPF firewall using OSPF instance. All the destinations are over here, and the default route is also here. So that's how you can configure dynamic routing on Palo Alto firewall.